All right. I know there were a couple of emails that I got from people over the weekend with some mentee type concerns. I think that the two biggest pieces that I'm getting from you guys are, and I really appreciate that you're asking me these questions, but like where, the general trend of where is the line on what type of feedback to give. That seems to be the biggest question, and it's hard for a number of reasons, but I think it's great experience, especially for those of you who have mentees in both 547 and 530. No, I was going to say no one has 547 and 534. That actually would have probably been a cool thing to do. Anyway, you guys as BCBAs, as you well know, are going to be mentoring a wide swath of individuals, from people who have never heard of ABA before, who are just starting off, to those who are about to graduate from master's programs. And you guys were at a disadvantage coming into this mentoring class, not knowing the individuals, not knowing their backgrounds, not knowing their instructional history. You didn't have a lot of variables, and you've had to kind of learn that on the fly. But I want you guys to be able to discern very quickly, or as quickly as possible, what that instructional history is. Let's say you get a person from another school or another agency whose instructional history you did not control. You're going to have to, and in a professional environment, you're going to have to figure out what that appropriate level of mentorship is very, very quickly. In those situations, you will get, oh, I'm comfortable with this. I want to learn that. I can't wait to do this. And then you'll hit the ground running and realize, oh crap, they're missing all the basic components. How do I adjust my expectations? How do I adjust my feedback? How do I adjust my learning targets? How do I adjust everything on the fly? And being able to I don't want to say be comfortable with all of that, because it's not always comfortable. It's not always comforting. But be able just to be able to be nimble enough to respond to the learner that you actually have in front of you. Just as you do with your kids, with any mentee, the trick is meeting them where they are and teaching them in ways that are meaningful to them, to their learning. So, still getting feedback or questions about how do I approach this specific response, and I think that those are good questions to have. And I don't always have the answer. You guys already have a history and a context with some of these mentees that I don't have. And we're at the point in the semester where I've seen enough work on their end where I am able to say, like, okay, given a mentor-mentee relationship, this is what I expect to see. And in one case, I responded to a mentee, and then I emailed the mentor just saying, hey, this is the feedback I gave, so that you are acutely aware that this is my expectation of this candidate. And I think that you guys can expect more of that to be coming over the course of the semester. All right. The second thing is I got my first, I don't want to say panicked email, but update email of, hey, I haven't gotten a lot from my mentee yet, and we're in week 9, and I'm worried about what's coming down the chute. And that's a situation that we all knew someone was going to experience, and I think you were all crossing your fingers that it wasn't going to be you. And at this point, what I would begin to be reaching out with a little bit more force, still positive, still encouraging, but just kind of reminding, like, hey, I know you got a lot of stuff going on. I know you have a lot of stuff that's due. Don't be the language that I would make sure to use is something along the lines of, don't worry about catching up all at once. Get me what you have. Let's get that turned in. A lot of people, when they do get behind, have a tendency to want to kind of push pause on everything, complete all the work that's missing, and then turn it in all at once. And if you've been in that situation before, one, you know how stressful it is for yourself. But from a mentor's standpoint, you know, you're dreading getting all of that stuff too, but also you're getting pissed off because you're like, I could be giving you feedback right now, and you're going to turn in all of this work without any feedback. And then I'm just going to say, this all sucks, go do it all again. Right. Maybe you're going to say something nicer than that, I hope, but you're definitely going to think something along those lines. And that's real. So forcefully but positively pushing a mentee to just turn the faucet on a little, get something into me so that I can get feedback. That's, you know, figuring out the right language, the right verbal behavior, the right to get them to start producing that work and get over that first hump. I think is necessary at this point. You know, we in week 4 or 5 we talked about how, you know, let's set up a routine, a schedule. We're past that point. Now it's time to push a little bit if you are in that situation. I will say that overall, I'm not getting a lot of questions in general from you guys. I'm definitely seeing marked improvement on the research summaries and the quizzes. The language that they're using is improving. The depth that they are writing with is improving. The type of information overall is improving. So I'm definitely seeing that feedback play a part in those responses, and I hope you guys are experiencing that and contacting some reinforcement from that from the mentor side as well. So keep that up. I think that what you guys are doing is good. I don't have any I don't have any suggestions in terms of changing process on a global level. I think that whatever you guys are doing for the most part is working, and keep it up. All right. Are there any questions about mentor mentee? Yeah, Laura.
I have one question just about like articles in general. For some reason, whenever we were in this class, I felt like we could only use Java articles or like some, you know, that kind of parameter. But like some of the articles they're using, I've never heard of the journals. Is there any
As long as it's a behavior analytic journal, we're okay with it. So it has to utilize it has to be peer reviewed. It has to utilize single subject design. It has to be, you know, related to socially significant behaviors, ideally for special education, but does not have to be. But any of those like 18 or so primary ABA journals right now, and any of those are going to be fine. Do you know offhand what journal it was?
I can't remember it because I was trying to look through. I think it was like probably like 2 feedback rounds ago, and it was just like a sketchy looking citation. I ended up finding it, but I just didn't know if there was anything specific. But
no, there's nothing. It's definitely a wider scope than just Java, but it does have to be behavior analytic.
okay.
Yeah. So and if you're ever unsure, that, you know, start with the design. If it's not a single subject design, then kick that back for sure. But if you have any questions, by all means, send me the article. Okay.
Dr. Shaman, what do you do if your mentor just informed you that she is dropping out of the program?
Yeah, I'm saddened about that situation for sure, because she was doing really, really well.
It was solid.
Yeah, there's not much that you can do. I mean, for you specifically in terms of your grade, don't worry about it. I don't want to switch anyone around at this point. There might be a situation where I might reach out to a couple of you, see if you want to tag team or work together. Because I know I asked a little bit more of some of you earlier in the semester. So we might be able to figure something out there. But in terms of your specific Isaac's grade, don't worry about that. But we wanted to make sure that you do equivalent work as well. So we'll get there. Okay. All right. Cool. Okay.
I have a question. It might be
Yeah.
a little unrelated, but it kind of is related. So we talked
Okay.
about like using single subject design. It has to be behavior analytic, and like the sign that they, I don't want to say the sign that it's not behavior analytic because it is, like this source is, but like we don't use statistics, like we don't do T tests or Z tests or whatever all of that is. But I read a lot of dissertations from Teachers College, and a lot of them have like statistical data if they have enough participants. So whenever we're analyzing those, like for the purposes, not even just of this class, but just research in general, like should we just disregard that or?
No. So I definitely was not the first, but I was definitely guilty of that. I used correlational research or a correlational component in my dissertation. And I'll say two things. One, there's almost always a purpose. There is always a purpose. Two, it is rarely the primary purpose. So there will usually be some correlational research and then a single subject component.
Right. There is always, like, I've never read one that doesn't have the single subject. I just never knew what like to do with that information. Like when I was reading it, like I didn't really know how much to read into it or if I should include that in a research summary or not.
Yeah. So I think, I can't remember, I feel like Lynn Dew's dissertation was just used in either an ANOVA or an ANCOVA. But in that situation, what the challenge for you as you're reading it is to try, especially because we don't use stats to analyze our data, is to identify way that was selected, why we did that, the person did go that route. What does that tell us that single subject design does not allow for? And if there was not a single subject component, what might be the next step? So like, I want there to be a different level of analysis when you do see those types of packages being used. Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry if that was a little off topic. It came up about single subject design, and I've been wanting to ask you that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. We good? Okay, cool. So this week we are not talking about naming. Next week we are talking about naming. But this week we are going to talk or start talking about the joining of the speaker and listener. And I really don't even know where the best place to start with this is. So, as we look at what we have evaluated over the past few weeks in the listener and speaker and the flow from pre-verbal into both listener and speaker. we've touched on this idea of how they are going back and forth and interacting. And a little bit last week, we started to look at the three arrows that are pointing down to the joining the listener and speaker pie. And what I think is problematic with, definitely with the pyramids, still to some degree with the pie charts, but less so, is there becomes this notion that movement from and between all of these different cusp and capabilities is stepwise. What I mean by that is that, you know, you're behaving here, and then you have a cusp induced, and then you're behaving here, then you have a cusp induced, and you're behaving here, then you have a cusp induced. And that is very much, you see what I'm saying? Does that concept make sense to you guys? So that the pyramids very, very much led to that visualization. But even on the pie charts, there's this of like, do this, then do this, then do this. And what we need to understand is that there's this slope, and it's not necessarily going to be an even slope, but there's a slope that runs through all of the protocols. So if we look at these steps now as passage of time and induction of cusping capabilities. All right. So let me, I think I know what I was trying to say. Let me, this is going to take a second, but bear with me. Learning. Whoa. Come on. Cusp. Learning. Cusp. Right? This is typically how it's looked at. There's like this static level of learning, and then when it's time, enough learning has passed, then we induce a cusp. And then there's this, after the induction of the cusp, there's this static level of learning, and then we induce another cusp. And it's stepwise like that. But that's not really the right way to look at it. If we just look at this red line, as passage of time, all right? And then the blue line are cusps that are induced. The third piece here is our pink line. Nope, too close to red. Green line. Which is rates of learning. All right. So why is it? What about the induction of cusps and capabilities prevents learning in between those cusps from being static and allows for that the change between baseline and cusp induction to be dynamic? What allows that to be a curve. Does that make sense? Is what I'm asking making any sort of sense?
Is it because we gain capabilities or capabilities are induced, so the way we learn is different?
Okay, good. So that second piece, the way we learn is different, but the way, but even so, when we looked at it this way, the way we're learning here, oh, that's terrible. I don't like that. The way we're learning here is still different than the way we're learning here. But why? But it's not this flowing way. What about the induction of the cusps allows for this changing rate? So I guess this is how I want you to look at this. So this range is the range of learning that is available based on the presence of a given cusp. All right, so this would show that before the cusp, no learning is being demonstrated that that results from this cusp. But then once the cusp is induced, all of the learning is above at the top of what is available for when that cusp is induced. I'm making like 6% sense right now based on your looks. All right, so let's take generalized imitation. Let's use a really concrete example, okay? So before generalized imitation, what this stepwise pattern means is I can't do any imitation. And then after generalized imitation, I can do all the imitation. All right? And then I have the next cusp, maybe listener literacy. Before listener literacy, I can do all the imitation, but none of the listener skills. And after the cusp, I can do all the listener skills. All right? Versus our green line, let's do a light green line. Before generalized imitation, I can do some of the imitation skills. And then after generalized imitation, I can do more of the imitation skills until I can do all of the imitation skills. All right? And then so on and so forth. And maybe we get to one where that's like this, where before listener literacy is induced, I can already do all the skills. All right. What term am I referring to here? What is the thing that allows for this to happen? We don't see these flat steps. We see this curved situation. You know, Maddie, you were definitely on the right track. We induce these cusps, and then what happens? They learn in new ways, but
Their community of reinforcers has expanded.
And what does that do? It changes their
Instructional history.
Instructional history.
Okay.
All right. And changing of an instructional history is not a stepwise process. Operant learning is learning. We're still going to get things wrong. We're still going to contact corrections. We're still going to need to contact reinforcers. More importantly, we have to, through differential reinforcement, learn which behaviors are going to contact reinforcers. All right. And sometimes it's the case that we've already demonstrated all of the behaviors without the induction of the cusp. And when that happens, that doesn't mean let me put it this way, without the use of a protocol, not the induction of the cusp. The cusp was induced, but a protocol was not necessarily used. So what we have to understand when let me go back to this guy. What we have to understand is that when we are doing all of this stuff, particularly when it's occurring in the natural environment, the instructional histories that are happening here are all building blocks to get down here. All right. So it's not, let me erase all of that. It's not possible for us to get to a point where we say, okay, we have all the listener skills, we have all the speaker skills, now it's time to join the two, right? An instructional history has inherently been built between listener behavior and speaker behavior to set the stage for speaker's own listener to emerge. All right. We have protocols that will induce listener behavior where there was none before. We have protocols to induce speaker behavior where there was none before. One of you is doing some research on that this semester. Joining of speaker and listener relies on behaviors that are already present, right? You cannot have joining listener and speaker without listener behavior. You cannot have joining listener and speaker without speaker behavior. This section relies on the instructional history that is established during listener and speaker induction. Okay, so it's very important to understand that when we get to joining of listener and speaker, we have to allow for instructional histories. We have to allow for the behaviors that are present to really have an effect. And we have to make sure that we are arranging contingencies such that those behaviors have an ability to interact. One of the things that I have told all of you, I think to a T at some point this semester, is we are not doing any projects on naming, right? The reason for that has nothing to do with my confidence in your ability to run MEI to induce naming. I think you guys can do that. I sure hope you guys can do that at this point. My hesitancy is because I don't think we do a good job of doing all the things before we get to naming to ensure that we indeed need to induce naming. And for those that we have, I'm still not sure that we're ready for it, right? So there are still prerequisite skills that are probably missing. So I want us to be able to have an understanding of what are some of the experiences, what are some of the behaviors that we expect to see, what are some of the prerequisites within the joining of speakers on listener pie that set the stage for something like naming. All right, does that make sense? One of, yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there. Okay, so all that being said, most of this pie is looking at conversational units. All right, so if we have to kind of separate this pie into two pieces, we have the components related to conversational units, and we have the components related to naming. Sorry, my cat's going crazy. So conversational units on one side, naming on the other side. So before, so yeah, let's leave it there. So conversational units, kind of like the previous paths we've taken. What are the pieces? First of all, is there an order to conversational units based on this pie? Let me zoom in. All right, so we have conversational units between an adult and a child, conversational units between children, say do correspondence, and self-taught conversational units in solitary play. Is there a hierarchy to these or not? How do we see these developing? And I want you guys to start thinking about the type of analysis that we did last week when we went from voices and faces all the way through to echoics and into mans and tax, right? And we saw how all of that kind of flowed together. So be thinking about what came before and how do we get to these conversational units, and what is going to be the critical prerequisite for any of them? All right. Let me ask you guys this, because sometimes I feel that my presence is an AO for a little bit of risk-taking behavior on your guys' part. Sorry, I'm just seeing the chat. Clarissa, I just saw that. Why don't I send you guys into groups of, I don't know, like 3 groups for like 4 or 5 minutes so that you guys can talk safely without me hearing it for a little bit, and then we'll see what we come up with. How does that sound? Yeah? Okay. Stop share, breakout 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 3 groups of 3. Okay, I'll see you guys in a few minutes. You guys want another question? How do we get to conversational units? And is there a hierarchy? Wide open question. What comes before conversational units, and is there an order to them? That's kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, go. All right. What do we come up with? Who wants to share?
A whole lot of nothing. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Sometimes breakout rooms are really good, and sometimes it's a whole lot of sitting around saying, I don't want to be here. I get it.
We were mostly just thinking about how you are watching us still.
Oh, no. No. I just watch your names.
Our group it was me, Maddie, and Brooke, and our brains kind of went to different places where like mine went all the way back to Mans, and then Brooke went all the way back to Echoics, and then Maddie brought up Sequilix and conversational unit. No, wait, no, that's the
Sequilic and introverbal behavior.
Yeah.
So responding when spoken to, and then Sequilix can be responding when spoken to or initiating speaker behavior to a listener.
So it's I like all three of those, and I like that Laura, what was the one that you went to?
I went to like the basic MAND.
Okay, so all right. So we have MANs, we have echoics, and we have sequilics and introverbals. And what's one of those? Actually, no. That's really interesting. That's kind of the dichotomy that you guys landed on, because you have MANs and you have echoics, which are two speaker behaviors. The echoic we've tied pretty conclusively to a listener behavior. And then when you have the introverbals and the sequelics, you're talking about speaker behavior that requires listener behavior, but it's not either within one's own self or is it reciprocal, right? So it's kind of, those are the two that are kind of a one-way street. But I like the breadth of behaviors that you guys covered there. Good. What else? Group 2, whoever that is. Go ahead, Rian. I don't know. I made that up. Rian, you're group 2 now. Go ahead.
Okay. I was like, oh. So what we did is kind of very similar to what they said. It was echoics, MANs, tax, interverbal, sequelics, and then conversational units.
Okay. So you're kind of saying that my interpretation of that is there is no one path, right? It's the interaction of all of them together that sets the stage for speakers on listener behavior and conversational units, right? Good. What about group 3? Whoever's left. Someone's gonna have to chime in because I have no idea who is in what group.
Okay, I guess that's us.
Go ahead.
So we talked a bit about like introverbals being a jumping point for our conversation and the interaction between potentially the adult and a child being, because we were kind of looking at it like in this pie, what would be the steps, like what would be the hierarchy to conversational units.
Okay.
And so I was thinking introverbals, and that is the initiation most often between an adult and a child. Sorry guys, Ollie wanted to participate. So the adult and a child would potentially come before the child, between children conversational units. And then we also talked about like self-talk during solitary play, how sometimes we see that happening with kids who aren't making like functional language, but they're like interacting with their toys, like going back and forth with each other. So we kind of talked about a couple of like what we've seen and why we think
Good, good. So I want to come back to, I'm going to circle, or I'm going to pi this right now. This I think is a really, really interesting one. So we'll come back to that in a second. All three groups, it sounds like, mentioned intraverbals, and sequelics were on everyone's mind. Without me giving you a definition or an answer, what is the difference between those two things? And this is an interesting one because I think, and I may be a little too much of a stickler for this, but this is one where I feel that the field has drifted from the technical definitions and caused a problem for itself. All right. So I think that when you guys are thinking of intraverbals, you're probably talking more about sequelics. When you talk about sequelics, I could see you guys going a couple of different ways. But I feel that for most of you, and I don't mean this as in any sort of bad way, it's a sequelic to you is that thing that's kind of not quite a conversational unit. Is that accurate? Yeah? Okay. So let's go back to an intraverbal. Intraverbals are, to me, very specific in terms of their scope, and it's much more limited than what we work with. All right. So if I hold up this picture and I say, what is this? Is that an intraverbal?
No.
No. Who says yes? Someone be brave. Rhiannon says yes. Okay. Why isn't it an intraverbal?
Well, like when you read about it, so like I know we're not talking about naming, but when you read about naming, there's pure tax and then intraverbal tax. So me responding, that is a phone, would be an intraverbal tax after you ask me, what is this? So you asking, what is this, wouldn't be the intraverbal, right?
I hate the word intraverbal tact and impure tact. They're bad words.
I recently have heard it as a man for information,
Okay.
and I appreciated it.
Good. So Maddie, sorry, I didn't mean to shut you down like that. I feel strongly about that. Because does anyone know the technical definition of an intraverbal? And even by the time you get to the naming research, and especially the later naming research, I think the term has been co-opted into something completely different.
Aren't they verbal responses with no point-to-point correspondence?
Yes, good, Courtney. Really good. Mary had a little lamp, right? That's an intraverbal. Okay, it's a fill in the blank. There are intraverbals that are not fill in the blanks, but there is, if I said my phone number is, and then you all independently filled in your phone numbers, that's a type of intraverbal. How do I get to the gas station? Oh, you turn left and right and go this way, and then at the corner you do a U-turn, right? That's an intraverbal. All right. They are vocal stimuli. There's a vocal antecedent and a vocal response that do not have point-to-point correspondence. There's no visual. So that intraverbal tact is the combination of those two things. I just don't think, I think that was creating something out of nothing. I don't think that what is it phone and intraverbal tact mesh. I think you're taking two things that have their own unique definitions and just mashing the words together, and hoping that we all understand what we're talking about. And we do. It's, you know, for better or worse, we do. And you're not going to get laughed out of a conference room if you say intraverbal tact or impure tact. But I don't think that's an appropriate way of looking at things. And I know we're kind of getting off topic a little bit, but I think it's important. The impure tact component was put in not just for MEI, but across the field, because there was this realization that not all children who are under vocal stimulus control are under non-vocal stimulus control. It's that simple. There is a line between, or for some kids, there's a line between when you say, what is it? And when you just hold up the picture. And if you get the intraverbal response, that is not necessarily predictive. And I keep saying it. If you get that response, it's not necessarily predictive of getting the tact response. So we needed something to fill in the blank. And I don't like where we landed. All right. Demand for information, that makes more sense to me. Right? Because a man is not limited to just vocal control. It's not just limited to tactile control, right? A man can be anything. A man is very much ubiquitous, where intraverbal and tact are not, right? So I think that man for information is a better tact for intraverbal than what we have as intraverbal. Okay.
Would you say, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, man.
Would you say that, okay, so you said that for some kids, they will respond under vocal control, but not under non-vocal control. So unless I'm wrong, so when you respond to an intraverbal, it's appropriate to use generalized reinforcement contingencies. But when we are using tax, we don't use we use natural reinforcement contingencies. So for them being like under the control of a vocal and a non-vocal antecedent, is it also tied to the reinforcement? Like, do they have conditioned social reinforcement or not?
It's a really interesting question. And I don't think we have an answer to that. I don't think that's been looked at. Now, the challenge with doing that research is starting from a consensus point of what the behavior actually is, right? Mm-hmm. So, intraverbals, the natural reinforcement for intraverbals is the completion of the intraverbal.
Acquiring the information.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the asking for directions is reinforced by the completion of getting directions, or that intraverbal. Mary had a little lamb is reinforced by completion of the phrase. Okay. Just like we talked about with all of the other components, there is this natural reinforcer to an intraverbal, right? I don't think, so if you're looking at an intraverbal and saying, if you want to go with intraverbal tact as your definition, okay, then the way that I would look at it is that there must be two concurrent reinforcers. One is social and one is completion of the intraverbal. So I guess the right way, the way that I would look at that is the response, any vocal response is contacting the intraverbal natural reinforcer. And by that, the correction, if they're incorrect, right? If I say Mary had a little frog, then that I would get a correction. And now that would be that new behavior would allow for the completion of the intraverbal response, independent of praise or social contact, right? So if I say Mary had a little and you guys all say lamb, you're not waiting for me to say good job. Your EO would be, for the love of God, somebody say lamb, right? It's just the completion. That's the intraverbal part. The intraverbal tact part then has to be, in my mind, has to be social. So I don't think using tokens and other reinforcers for an intraverbal tact, it would be appropriate. And functionally, you're still talking about the acquisition of, of joining of listener and speaker. You tricked me into getting into talking about naming, which cannot be under SD control. We cannot only attend to that response when a token is present. So I think I think that it has to be for any intraverbal. It has to be under that reinforcement control. And I guarantee you that's different than what most of your BCBAs are telling you what to do or how to do it. And that's as much my fault as anybody else because I taught them all. Not all, but many of them. But it's that nuanced look at joining of speaker and listener, conversational units, naming, that I think we do fail on. I think that there is a gap there. All right, so now that we've covered the intraverbal in a pretty good way, what the hell is a sequelic? All right, so a sequelic is part of a conversational unit. That is correct. A sequelic is listener behavior that is reinforced by speaker behavior that may or may not be reinforced by listener behavior. Okay? The challenge with a sequelic is knowing who is doing what and who is behaving in which way. All right? So I think, and this is very much a theoretical conversation. So I think you can have a listener sequelic and you can have a speaker sequelic. I think those are two different things. But I think from that, you can start to see where we get the ball rolling. So I can, as a speaker, say something. And if it is reinforced by a listener's behavior, that can be looked at as a sequelic. All right. I can emit, so then the listener, can behave. And if that behavior is speaker behavior that is reinforced by a listener, that is a sequelic. All right. A sequelic must involve two people. It must involve a listener and a speaker. All right. Where it gets tricky is that middle person. So I guess I probably said that a little bit wrong, and I apologize. Let me read. So we have the speaker behavior that's reinforced by the listener. That part's straightforward, right? I say something, you respond in some way, sequelic. I listen, and then I speak. That is a sequelic, or a version of a sequelic. All right, what's the difference? The difference is that for the listener, who's reinforced by the speaker, the reinforcement lies in the feedback that you are getting. I said something. Sorry, the speaker is reinforced by the listener. I said something and someone else responded. You got that? Okay. The flip side, and this is challenging, my speaker behavior is my own reinforcer. It's reinforcing listening to the first person. So, how many of you have had the kid who is jumping out of their pants waiting to talk? And they have to wait and listen. And then they start talking, and they don't give a shit if anyone's listening. They're just talking. The opportunity to talk based on that listener behavior, that's the sequelic. All right. This is a really good one to talk about in terms of hyperbole. All right. So if I have the child who says something, is reinforced by someone else responding, either with vocal or non-vocal behavior, and then they just walk away. They don't care about continuing it. So that's one half of the sequelic. The other half is what I just described. All right, which is I listen, and then I speak, and then the operand ends. Now it's possible to listen, speak back, but the person who initially spoke doesn't care what I have to say. So I emitted the person two emitted a sequelic because they listened and their response was speaking back. They were hoping to emit a conversational unit, but they no longer had a listener. So you'd have to analyze, and then in that situation, the first person may or may not have been reinforced by the second person listening and responding. So you'd have to analyze that. If you've ever done a vocal verbal operant probe with typical kids, it is the biggest pain in the ass you can ever do for my money in behavior analysis, because you start getting into these nuances of, was that a sequelic? Was that a conversational unit? Who's a conversational unit for? How many conversational units was it? Are we counting the whole conversation as a conversational unit with multiple exchanges, or do I look at each exchange as a conversational unit? Like, you can pull your hair out trying to figure out what to count. I'll give you a really quick way through. It probably doesn't matter. All right. What you're looking for at that level is, do they emit sequelics or majority sequelics, or do they emit majority conversational units? Right. That's all you're really looking for. You do want to know if within their repertoire is the ability to go back and forth multiple times and literally hold a conversation if they can contact reinforcement through that. But you know, the nuance of it, it's a good exercise. Don't ever try and turn anything in where you've counted all those things. It does not go well for yourself, not for me. I don't care. For you, it's a terrible process. Yes, I'm speaking from experience and I'm scarred. But that's what a sequelic is. All right. Sequelics are a stepping stone. I never really thought about this. Sequelics are broken conversational units. Sequelics are faulty conversational units. When you get a sequelic, most of the time as a technician, most of the time, your response is your behavior is going to be redirecting the kid back to the play area to continue the conversation. So they've walked away and now it's, oh, I probably have a sequelic here. Let's get them back so that I can provide an opportunity to reinforce the conversational unit. All right. Sequelics are you know, they very much have function for sure. But I like that idea of sequelics are not standing on their own as functional verbal behavior. It's a stepping stone to a conversational unit. And I, you know, there are ways to exit conversations through sequelics, but I think for the most part, when you see sequelics, what you really want are conversational units. Okay. There's a 30-minute answer to who knows what question, but I think it's important, right? So if you know, we talked about echoics, we talked about MANs, we talked about tax, we talked about all those things, but I do think that these intraverbal, true intraverbal, and sequelic behaviors are important for conversational units. How are they different than listener literacy? How are they different than echoics? How are they different than tax? What sets them apart that sets the stage for conversational units? Should be pretty clear. In some capacity, they involve two individuals who are both emitting listener and speaker behavior. All right. What I like about, I think Brooke, you guys said, Brooke said MANs. No, Laura said MANs. Laura said MANs. What I like about that is when you are teaching conversational units, it's not necessarily that a MAN is prerequisite to the sequelic or to the first half. When you're teaching conversational units, I think that using the MAND is the easiest way to bridge that gap. You know, ask him about his weekend. Ask him if you can play with this. Ask him what he's doing about it, right? So you go back to that man for information, I think, in a much more functional way. If you can't tell, I don't want anyone ever saying, what is this anymore? But you're going to, and that's fine. But using MANs as ways to extend sequelics is a low effort response that children typically have in their repertoire when they're at this stage, that the more natural it is, the response that they are getting, think about this, the response that they are getting to that MAND, which is information via verbal behavior, reinforces what is now the conversational unit. So MANs, I think, inserting MANs into or on top of sequelics, I think is a really strong way of getting, of creating an EO for the type of information that is exchanged in a conversational unit. Most of what we have conversations about are extended tax, right? Most of our, with some mans in between. I think a much more interesting analysis, if you are going to sit down and script out everything that kids say, is where are the tax, where are the mans?
So would you say
How-
that? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Would you say that transformation of motivating conditions across mans and tax is prerequisite to conversational units then?
I wouldn't, because I don't know. I'm thinking about it in terms of, in those situations, my no answer is that in a conversational unit, mans and tax still clearly have their own EOs and function in their own ways. My yes answer is that the information that you use in the man function, you have to be able to use in the tact function. So it's all about stimulus control, right? And acquiring a stimulus through one EO and being able to apply it in the second EO.
Right. Like when you,
Right, so if you can
when
learn-
said- I had never thought about it before, and we didn't talk about it in our group, but whenever you just said that conversational units are extension of tact behavior, and then you said we're manding for that information, I was like, well, wait,
Yeah.
if you're doing that, then you have to have like it has to go across both establishment operations. So I was
Yeah.
just
And I think that, and to that point, I think, ooh, this would be cool. You get the kids that man for information, and then you ask them a question, and it's like, never, they never heard it. And I wonder if transformation of mans and tax is the reason why, because they've non-behaviorally compartmentalized that information into the man function and are not using it as part of any tact extension, right? And then as the technician, you're like, he just told you what the answer is, right? That's really interesting. I don't know. That's definitely, that concept that I just said is definitely a prerequisite later on for social listener reinforcement and kind of the more audience related custom capabilities. So that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Good. Oh, I had something really good to say about self-talk. It's gone. It's totally gone. Shoot. Sorry. It happens. Okay, so we have we'll try and wrap up. I know we're running a little bit late. We have these three main, I'm going to ignore say do right now. I do think say do falls into that same conversation that we had before about correspondences. I think that control is very much there, that control of correspondence in another mode, like that really falls into that same idea. But once that is all there, and that is definitely going to be necessary. Sorry, I'm doodling a little bit. We do have these three conversational units. We do have adults between children and the self-talk. And I do think that, oh, I know what I think I know what I was gonna say. The way that I would look at it, I think, is self-talk is the goal. Because that is truly speaker's own listener behavior. All right. Self-talk is a dependent variable. It is an effect of conversational units with adults and conversational units with other children. As those repertoires expand, if nothing else, you are getting an instructional history. You are getting more and more models of how you can interact as a speaker and a listener. All right. And I think that the self-talk is demonstrative of all those experiences. If you look at a child who plays teacher by themselves, Clarissa brought up anthropomorphic toys earlier, right? They play teacher. So they set up their little stuffed animals and they get the chalkboard and they do the whole thing, right? That is an effect of conversational units between adults and children. Shows the conditioned reinforcers that result, the language, everything that derives from those conversations with adult then shows up as a conditioned reinforcer for the content of a self-taught conversational unit. Right? Go ahead, Amanda. I see it.
Have you read Pharrell 2017?
No, I have not.
Okay, so the whole dissertation, so she did the initial study on the STIP protocol, the self-talk immersion protocol, on the effects of self-talk and say-do correspondence and conversational units with adults and with children. And then her follow-up study, which was what Pharrell 2017, like her dissertation was on, was relating the self-talk immersion protocol and the cusps that it induced to reverse intraverbals. And that reverse intraverbal responding can be used to study the analyze the speaker's own listener cusps that a child has. So I never understood how do you get from reverse intraverbals to speaker's own listener? But is it because of the instructional history, like intraverbals are within conversational units and then conversational units are within self-talk? Is that why?
Yeah, I mean that I need to go look at it, and I apologize for not being.
I've read it several times, and
I've seen her, honestly. I've never read it, but I've seen her present on it so many times, and I've just not attended to that piece, so I apologize. But yeah, without knowing any more specifics, I can confidently say that instructional history is what gets you from A to B, because that's what all of these are about, right? That instructional history is either an instructional history of contact with new reinforcers to condition them, or contact with newly conditioned reinforcers to see what emerges. And that's what you're talking about, right? So you, through say-do correspondence and self-talk, you've conditioned, and then what happens as a result, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's what that's the way that I would look at that.
Okay, I just was never able to draw the line, and now that we're talking about like instructional history, it's like it's making a little bit more sense.
Yeah, and that this is what I'll end on tonight. I'm sorry that this felt like a little bit more of a convoluted conversation, but still really, really good. The importance of allowing time to pass after a cusp is induced is so critical, because behavior change, as we all know, is not instant. And learning is a behavior. Learning is going to change over time. So we need opportunities to see whether or not some of these other behaviors naturally emerge. I can't imagine that in that study there was pre-probe, pre-experimental probe, induction, post-experimental probe, post-probe, post-probe. Time elapsed. You have to let that time elapse. You know, test for conversational units, not there. Do some stuff. You know, let kids play, talk to kids, do things. Test again. Oh, still not there. Now we induce something. Test, let time pass, test. And your first to your last is what's going to really matter. And what you do in between the two time periods is the same. And what you show is that the induction of this cusp is what allowed you to contact these behaviors. But it was the instructional history with these behaviors that allowed for the next thing to emerge. God, I hope that made sense. So let me draw that out and then we'll be done.
Are we going to talk about speaker as own listener next week too?
Yeah, we have like 2 more weeks of it. Yeah, we're not done with this one. So you have a pre-probe. All right, whatever behavior you want, and then you do some stuff, and then you test it again, and it's still low. All right, then I test for my independent variable. So this is my dependent variable. Then I test, right that, for the presence, and I might do this at the beginning too, of my independent variable. And I teach it. I have mastered it. Yay. Okay. Now, get this. I test for my dependent variable again, and I still don't have it. But now I do all the stuff, and I do have it. All right. What this shows is that when this is present, I can learn through this. When it's not, I can't. That's the type of study that you're showing there. So there's passage of time. There has to be behavior that allows us to contact new contingencies. There has to be reinforcement for those new contingencies that is now conditioned, that allows operants to grow. You know, those are the principles that are acting on change of behavior based on the induction of a customer capability. And what she did is take the whole package and try and say, you know, I glossed over say-do correspondence, but it's the glue, right? It's that correspondence piece. When we talk about any of these, that correspondence piece is huge. If you can't say something and then see the correspondence between that and what you do, then yeah, the rest of it absolutely falls apart. But she's looking at, okay, if we have that, then what comes? And if we have this other piece, then what comes? There's nothing, if I have self-talk or whichever, if I have say-do, if I don't have the opportunity to converse, conversational units, aren't going to induce. And right when say do is induced, I haven't had any more conversations. Right? Hopefully next week I might have some data that can continue to show this concept. I'm working on something like that right now. So, all right, cool. It's late. We're tired. Any questions?
I just have a question.
Again,
Do you have any
yeah.
available appointments this week that I could set up for my project?
Yeah, I think so. Send me an email, okay, Brooke? And anyone else who's looking for it.
I'm going to send you one
Okay.
too. I want to talk about my project, and then I have a lot more questions that we don't have time for tonight. So I'm going to schedule a meeting.
Fair
Fair enough.
One more
Fair
question
enough.
about my project. I'm sorry. Did you say we can't do naming?
Okay.
We can't have.
Yeah.
We're not supposed to do naming.
That was what we had talked about before.
Okay.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. I was just making sure.
We'll talk. All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. All right. Have a good one, guys. Bye.